we'll get started. Good evening and welcome, everyone. Greetings from New York City, where we are in the middle of a big snowstorm. But the silver lining is that we've now switched this event from in-person to online. So welcome many friends and colleagues from around the world. My name is Qin Gao. I'm a professor at Columbia University. And tonight, I have the great honor of serving as the host in my role as the acting director of Columbia's Asian American Initiative. We will have a great panel discussion with 6 top experts on Asian Americans in focus. We will record this event so that others can watch the video afterwards. If you're in the audience and have a question or comment for our speakers, please feel free to enter them into the Q&A box along the way. As many of you know, Columbia has a long history. This May, Columbia will turn 272 years old. But Columbia never stops growing, innovating, and expanding. 2 years ago, under the leadership of Executive Vice President for Arts and Sciences, Amy Hungerford, and the founding director, Professor Jennifer Lee, we launched the Asian American Initiative. Our mission is to conduct rigorous research, amplify Asian American voices, and shape policy and action. The Columbia Asian American Initiative also has a distinct focus on social sciences. Only through high-quality data and rigorous research can we accurately and fully capture the Asian American narrative and advance policy and action. Tonight, we have the amazing opportunity to learn from our outstanding panelists, to learn from their research about Asian American identities, sense of belonging, intergenerational mobility, economic well-being, mental health, and many other topics. Thank you for our panelists for sharing your work with us. We look forward to a very engaging discussion. Now, I have a question for you, the audience members. For those of you who identify as Asian American, when, at what moment did you first adopt this identity? And was it a conscious decision? For those of you who don't identify as Asian American, what comes to your mind when you think of the term Asian American? What perceptions do you have about this population? I myself am a proud Asian American, and I'm a proud New Yorker. For me, becoming Asian American has been a journey. 25 years ago, I first arrived in New York to pursue my PhD at the Columbia School of Social Work. Little did I know, I was making history. I was the first ever PhD student from mainland China to pursue PhD in the school's over 100 years of history. Over these 25 years, I've transformed from an international student to a professor, from a non-resident alien to a long-term resident, and from an Asian immigrant to Asian American. I've pursued research on Asian Americans and Asian New Yorkers. I've taught many cohorts of students across campus, and I've given birth to 2 Asian American boys who are also proud New Yorkers. I know tonight we have many students in our audience. I want to give a special welcome to you, the students. You are our inspiration. We do research, we offer education for you because you are the future. You're going to lead the way for our future and for the field of Asian American studies. I want to thank Dean Miguel Arqueola of Social Sciences and Dean Melissa Begg of Social Work, who are here with us this evening. I also want to thank our donors and supporters whose vision and generosity inspire us every day. And I want to thank my capable and tireless staff team, Teresa, Winston, Jordan, Emily, Veronica, Shay, and our student volunteers. You make tonight possible. Now, it gives me great honor and pleasure to introduce to you our amazing moderator for tonight, Professor Van Tran. Professor Tran is Professor of Sociology and International Migration Studies at CUNY Graduate Center. Professor Tran is an immigration scholar and urban sociologist. His research and teaching engage with New York City and its communities as a social laboratory for innovation and action. I cannot think of anyone better positioned to be our moderator for tonight. So thank you, Van, for agreeing to do this. I turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Qin. Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here and to moderate this important panel on Asian Americans in Focus, Data, Narrative, and Action. Thank you to the Asian American Initiative and to Columbia University for hosting and supporting this event. And thank you, Qin, for convening us today. Let me tell you that we are in for a real treat. We have 5 incredible panelists with a tremendous amount of expertise in academia, research, policy, advocacy, nonprofits, and surveys focusing on Asian Americans. And I'm really, really excited to be learning from their research and their ideas. Let me say a word about the format of the panel before we begin. We have asked each of the panelists to begin with a summary of their current research and why that research is important. That will provide an overview and a starting point for the moderated part of the conversation, which will run about 40 minutes. And by 6:40 or so, we'll open up to Q&A, and we'll end promptly at 7 p.m. And just to echo Qin, to the undergraduate and the graduate student members in the audience, we hope to hear from you in the Q&A. I will now introduce the panelists in the order in which they will speak. Their CVs are long, so I'm going to just be brief. Song is a professor of sociology and a faculty member of the Asian American Initiative at Columbia University. Prior to coming to Columbia, Professor Song was the Schiffman Family Presidential Professor of Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. She's an expert on social mobility, occupations and work, Asian Americans, and quantitative methodology. Her current work examines Asian Americans and the historical origins of the model minority narrative, focusing on their education, labor market outcomes, and intergenerational mobility from 1882 to the present. This work is funded by the National Science Foundation, and we'll hear some of it today. She's an award-winning scholar, and her research has been published in many leading academic journals, including 3 different disciplines: demography, economics, and sociology. She received her PhD in sociology from UCLA. What I most admire about her work is the creativity and the rigor with which she approaches the research. Combining eclectic data sources with innovative methodology is a hallmark of her scholarship, and you see that today. Our next speaker is Dr. Stacie Tao. Dr. Tao is a postdoc scholar at the University of Chicago Crow Family School of Social Work, Policy, and Practice. She's an expert on economic insecurity, child welfare policy, and Asian Americans. Her work examines the impact of income support programs and policies, including cash transfers, child tax credit, guaranteed income, on child welfare and family well-being, poverty, and material hardship. We're delighted to welcome her back to Columbia University, where she received her PhD in social welfare policy and her MSW. And her work pays tremendous attention to the intra-Asian diversity and inequality to reveal unique disadvantages faced by some Asian groups. Our third speaker comes from outside of academia, Ms. Sruthi Chandrasekaran, from the Asian American Foundation, where she's the Director of Data and Research. The Asian American Foundation was launched in 2021 with $250 million in funding at the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic and the peak of anti-Asian violence to support AAPI research, policy, and advocacy. She's an expert on survey research and evaluation, and she brings her global perspective and international experiences to the work. At Taft, she's working on the social tracking of Asian Americans in the US index, the Status Index, which is an annual survey since 2021. Taft and Status Index connects public perceptions of Asian Americans in the US with the lived experiences of Asian American communities here. She also studies mental health and well-being of AA and HPI youth aged 14 and 24. And this is a very important group because they have basically the highest suicide rates in the country among Asian Americans. She received her MSc from University of Oxford in comparative social policy. Our fourth speaker, there's a long list, is Mr. Alex Chu, who is the director on the Emory Speak team at the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago, NORC. He's an expert on public opinion and market research, including branding and reputation research and large-scale multinational surveys. Prior to NORC, Alex spent 20 plus years at the Harris Poll, which is a market research agency, and at NORC, most importantly, he leads Amplify API, which is the first ever panel survey designed to scientifically represent AA and HPI communities, which is the fastest growing racial group in the US, a $6 million investment in data infrastructure for this community. And in many ways, Alex is the spokesperson for Amplify API to broad audiences in academia, businesses, lawmakers, and nonprofits. And he's truly a champion of AA and HPI representation and inclusion in US survey research, a topic that we'll come back to again and again today. Last but not least, we have one of our very own, Professor Christopher Wimer, Dr. Christopher Wimer, who directs the Center on Poverty and Social Policy at Columbia University School of Social Work. He's the PI on the Robin Hood Poverty Tracker, a panel study that measures poverty and well-being in New York City. He's an expert on the measurement of poverty, historical trends of poverty, and the impacts of social policies on the poverty rate. And he has published widely across multiple journals in disciplines such as demography, sociology, criminology, and public policy. Chris received his PhD in sociology and social policy from Harvard. And what I admire about Chris' research is that it has strong policy and public impact. If there's an article in the New York Times on poverty, chances are Chris is cited in it, saying something intelligent. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor C. Song, who's going to get us started.
Great, so let me share my screen. Okay. It's my great honor to be part of this panel, and thanks Qin for organizing this panel and for Ben for this very generous introduction and wonderful summary of my research. So today, I would like to just very briefly share with you the part of the research that Ben mentioned very briefly about the changes in Asian American social mobility over the last century. Let me see. Okay. Well, so this work can be traced back to about 2017 when I started to contact the US Census Bureau to see if I can get access to their millions of records from their census enumeration forms for me to get access to the whole Asian American population so that I can always follow individuals and their families over time. And we combine this with historical records, which has already been made recently available by different research teams at Princeton, Northwestern, and the EPUMS team to link individuals across historical censuses. So over time, we want to understand when did model minority emerged in the US history. So now all of us are already familiar with this term, which was first proposed in the 1970s in a New York Times Magazine article, which was first used to describe Japanese Americans, comparing them with Black Americans, but later was applied just to all the Asian ethnic groups to describe their exceptional educational and socioeconomic achievement. But if we really look closely to the historical changes, so here are some of the major findings I would like to highlight from our research. Or later, I'm happy to answer more questions about how we did this. But here, I want to show you this plot. Okay, so you see panel A and panel B, which follows our Asian American cohorts with other racial and ethnic groups from the 1820 cohort to 1980. So from the plot, Asian Americans are highlighted by the red dotted line. So as you can see that this is really the critical historical period when we see that Asian Americans, for the first time, their mean years of education surpassed the mainstream Americans represented by the white group. And when did this happen? It was 1910 birth cohort. Remembering that Asians were still experiencing what was so-called the Asian Exclusion Period or the Chinese Exclusion Act, along with the Gentleman's Agreement and a series of other discriminatory acts for Asian Americans. So Asians already surpassed the whites in their educational attainment even during this exclusionary time period. So that means, well, if we really want to trace back the model minority term, we can pinpoint this to our historical time where Asians experienced severe discrimination. But if we look at Asians, their occupational attainment, we would see that it happened much later. So the first birth cohort in the US history that Asians surpassed the whites in their occupational status happened around the 1930 birth cohort. For this cohort, most of them actually entered the labor force in the 1950s and 1960s after the end or the repeal of the Asian Exclusion Act, and mostly during the civil rights movement. So we argue that there is a misalignment in the timing of this model minority term when we talk about it in terms of education versus occupation. So before the end of the exclusion period, particularly before the end of the World War II or the civil rights movement began, Asians were not able to translate their educational advantage into their occupational advantage. So they encountered a lot of labor market discriminations or disadvantages that could not be overcome by their educational attainment. But if we look at social mobility, so conditional on children from families that have exactly the same economic status, we see that here are two periods. So the left-hand side shows that during the exclusion period between 1882 to 1943, and the right panel indicates what we call the post-civil rights period. For the historical period for Asians, so across the socio-economic spectrum, so conditional on children from the same poor families, we see that Asian children achieved a much higher educational attainment than their white counterparts. But there is no change or no difference among children from rich families or families with highly educated parents. And this pattern is consistent across historical period, which means that if we really want to describe model minority, so there is a very similar pattern for the historical period as what we observe for the contemporary period. So there is striking historical consistency. However, if we look at occupational attainment, there is a dramatic reverse over time. So for the historical period, Asians across the socioeconomic spectrum of family status, Asians consistently have lower occupational status than their white counterparts, regardless of whether they are from poor families or from rich families. But during the post-civil rights movement, now Asians consistently have higher occupational attainment than their white counterparts, regardless of these children were born into a poor family or into rich families. So these are the most important findings from our research, which indicate that to understand Asians' socioeconomic advantage or disadvantage, we need to situate it into this broader historical perspective to understand how social changes, particularly that happened during the 1940s to 1960s, help shape what we observe for Asian Americans nowadays. I think I will stop here for now as we only have a few minutes.
Thank you, C. That's amazing. Stacie.
Thank you so much. Okay. Okay, wonderful. Good to see everyone, and such a pleasure to be here alongside the other panelists and researchers that I dearly admire and have had the privilege of learning from. So I'm happy to share with you all some work examining poverty within the Asian American population by its disaggregated Asian ethnic groups. So I want to start off my time today by sharing that my journey into Asian American poverty research was quite unintentional. So I previously came from work in child welfare systems, and like much of the poverty and inequality field, we were focused on differences between Black, Latino, and American Indian populations who are disproportionately affected by many systems. So my original aim was to study this defining and persistent characteristic of inequality in the United States, which were poverty gaps across ethno-racial groups. And so as such, Asian Americans were not central to that inquiry. But as I dive into this work, I've come to terms with the reality that studying Asian American poverty is in and of itself an exercise of contradictions. One major contradiction is driven by the high socioeconomic inequality within the group, and that dominant narratives portray Asian Americans as economically well off, but meanwhile, subsequently leaves out information on the severity of economic hardship within the population. And additionally, there's these contradictions between what we see in the empirical literature, which is extremely slim on this population, and what we know to be true and challenging in our communities that can be difficult to reconcile. So in exploring this contradiction, I was surprised to learn about two major gaps in the literature. The first being that Asian American economic insecurity was understudied and often left out altogether in the seminal poverty literature, and this was often due to limited or inaccurate data. And second, among the slim evidence available, the use of aggregation in several regards was quite common. The first being that research and policy practices commonly aggregated Asian Americans into a single monolithic category, which as a practice fails to capture the substantial socioeconomic diversity within the group from both theoretical and methodological regards. And second, the reliance on median income indicators and outdated poverty measures among this aggregate group led to findings that claim Asian Americans have, quote, reached economic parity with the white population. So this overlap in gaps, I like to call it aggregating the aggregate, and this has motivated two following main questions. So first, what are the ethno-racial poverty gaps using updated measures? And I will share a bit more about that shortly. And how does the Asian American population compare? And second, what are the intra-Asian American poverty levels across its 20 different ethnic groups? Okay, so on this slide, I have a figure that displays poverty rates across the 5 major ethno-racial groups: white, Black, American Indian, Alaska Native, Latino, and Asian Americans. And here I use 2 different poverty measures. The official poverty measure, which is called the OPM in darker red, and then I also have the supplemental poverty measure, the SPM, in a lighter shade of red. So the OPM, which many of you may know as the federal poverty line, is an outdated measure of poverty that really only considers pre-tax incomes set against a minimum threshold, and that is adjusted by household size. The SPM, on the other hand, is a vast improvement from the OPM because it accounts for many different factors. It accounts for geographic variations in the cost of living. It incorporates taxes, public assistance benefits. All of that is factored into its poverty calculation. So for this, I utilize the Census Bureau's American Community Survey data, the one-year public use microdata samples, and I selected 2015 to 2019 period because I wanted to capture a pre-pandemic snapshot. So as new data is becoming available in the Census Bureau, particularly 2021 to 2025 will be the next step to look at a post-pandemic period. So just here, as you can see, Asian American poverty differs quite substantially, just under using these two different poverty measures, more so than any other group. So Asian American poverty is 6 percentage points higher under the SPM than the OPM. And this translates to an SPM rate that is 56% higher than the OPM rate. And this is particularly attributed to two main things. First, that the SPM accounts for high costs of living in the often urban areas where the vast majority of Asian Americans live, which exceed their income. And second, that Asian Americans have some of the lowest welfare participation rates of any racial group. So in other words, among low-income Asian Americans who are eligible for public benefits, a relatively smaller proportion of them actually receive public assistance compared to eligible individuals in other groups. So it's no surprise that under the OPM, prior literature has come to this conclusion that Asian Americans have reached economic parity with white populations. But just this figure alone shows us that the OPM vastly underestimates poverty among Asian Americans, more so than any other racial group. So continuing to rely on the OPM for important decision making, such as determining public benefit eligibility and even just counting the low-income population, it really skews our understanding of poverty within the Asian American population and will eventually lead to inequitable policy design and resource allocation. So next, I want to get on a more granular level of SPM poverty within the Asian American population. So here I disaggregate by 20 different Asian ethnic groups that are represented in the Census Bureau. So here, this dotted line demonstrates the population average SPM rate, which is approximately 17%. And I split this by the following three categories. So Asian American ethnic groups that fall below the population average are on the lightest shade of red in the left, and groups that are approximately on par with the population average are shown in medium red, which are in the middle. And groups that have poverty rates well above the population average are shown in dark red on the right-hand side. So in this figure, what stands out most strikingly to me are the wide disparities that exist within the Asian American population alone. And as we know, the 6 largest groups, which in order are Chinese Americans, followed by Indian, Filipino, Vietnamese, Korean, and Japanese Americans. Of these 6 largest groups, Chinese, Vietnamese, and Korean Americans have poverty rates that far exceed the white population. And notably, the Chinese and Vietnamese populations have SPM poverty rates that are nearly on par with Black, Latino, and American Indian populations, which is around 22 to 23%. So knowing that there are these large poverty gaps within the Asian American population, another vein of my research aims to examine these claims that the population has nearly achieved economic parity with white populations. I don't have time to show it in detail, but essentially it uses decomposition analyses to estimate the extent to which various demographic characteristics can explain the white to Chinese poverty gap, the white to Korean poverty gap, and the white to Vietnamese poverty gap. And among this, I see that the largest driver of these poverty gaps are immigration factors, particularly nativity. And despite this common rhetoric that Asian American parity with the white population is driven by high educational attainment, we see that despite having higher educational attainment among several of these groups, it doesn't necessarily translate to lowered poverty rates. So this suggests that some returns to education may be limited when other immigration contexts come into play. Okay, that's all I have for you today. Thank you very much. I'll pass it on to, is it Shruthi?
Yes,
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Stacie. Great. That's a hard act to follow, but I'll try. Thank you again, Stacie. Hi, everyone. It's a real honor and privilege to be here today. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion portion of today's session as well. As Van very generously introduced all of us, I'm the Director of Data and Research at the Asian American Foundation. Van also mentioned how TAF was set up over 5 years ago when during COVID, anti-Asian violence was rampant. We know that the discrimination in our communities faced at that time was only a symptom, right? It was not the first time we were witnessing that kind of violence. And one of the root causes of this issue is the stereotypes, the perceptions and misperceptions and the perspectives about our communities that exist. I think, C talked a little bit about the model minority myth. Stacie, you talked about how, we're not a monolith, but also being viewed as a threat. The yellow peril stereotype is another prevalent stereotype. Along with the perpetual foreigner stereotype. I'm sure many of us in this virtual room have been asked, where are you really from? And so that, along with the model minority myth as well. So having all of these stereotypes, how do they really inform how we, as the Asian American community, is being viewed? And also, why is it that in certain areas, we're not expected to excel, where we hit a bamboo ceiling because we're not seen as the stereotypical authoritative leader, etc. And so the reason I'm saying all of this is because TAF's research really revolves around two, I would say, key aspects. One is, which is, the external in. So how do other groups really view the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities, and what's driving these misperceptions and stereotypes? And that's why we launched our status index, which is the social tracking of Asian Americans in the United States. This is an annual nationally representative survey, which is really like a pulse check on how we are viewed by other communities. The second part of our of TAF's research is more internal out, which is more like what are our needs as the Asian American community, and getting a more granular insight. So I'll get to that in just a bit, but I wanted to highlight some of the key findings from our status index study from last year. As I mentioned, this is a nationally representative survey of Americans. And because this was year 5, it's also special because we were able to compare trends over time. And so we found that increasingly Americans are seeing Asian Americans as being more loyal to their countries of origin than the United States. And so as you can see, last year it was at an all-time high of 40% of Americans who believe that Asian Americans are indeed more loyal to countries of origin than to the United States. We also found that more than 1 in 4 Americans are concerned that Chinese Americans are a threat to the US. And so 27% of Americans said, yes, I'm at least somewhat concerned. And specifically, the people who saw Chinese American as a threat, it was mainly around as a threat to national security. Or this finding, which is about how 56% of Americans did not fully agree that the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II was wrong. This finding is particularly alarming to me, just given the threats to our civil liberties happening around us today, and knowing that a majority of Americans did not fully agree that the incarceration of Japanese Americans was wrong of the United States to do that. This is was one of our favorite questions. We ask Americans to name a famous Asian American, and consistently we found that over the last 5 years, people are just not able to name a single famous Asian American. And when they do name someone, it's Jackie Chan, who is not American. It's Bruce Lee, who died over 50 years ago. And even though this specific survey last year was fielded in January, so very close to the heels of the election, only 4% named former Vice President Kamala Harris. And so our status index really tells us, what kinds of stereotypes and misperceptions continue to exist, what might be driving some of it, and how can we do better. I invite all of you to check out our website, and you can download the study there. You can also look through the findings, and we also have a data playground, so you can play around with the questions and cut the data into different sociodemographic characteristics to draw your own findings as well. The second part of our work, which is more around understanding the status of our communities and what can be done to transform the situation. So we are creating a sense of safety, a sense of safety, so perceived safety, but also actual safety, building a sense of belonging, as well as pathways to prosperity for our communities, which is, all of that is part of our mission. And so I wanted to give the example of our youth mental health work. And this is a study that we released in late 2024. It's called Beyond the Surface. It was basically, as Van mentioned, we wanted to better understand the needs of AAPI youth. And we know that in several conversations, including on mental health, we've been left out of the conversation. And Van mentioned how the CDC also found that suicide was the leading cause of death amongst Asian American youth in that 15 to 24 age group. And it's the second leading cause of death for NHPIs. And so we wanted to understand, dig a little deeper to understand what was going on, and through that wanted to build the most sort of comprehensive, disaggregated, nationally representative data on how API youth are doing, what are their unique needs, and how can they be better supported. Again, just highlighting a few key findings from our study. When we asked about suicidality, we found that 3 in 10 young ANHPIs reported having planned or attempted suicide in their lifetime. And this was actually a question that we adopted from the Suicide Behaviors Questionnaire, SBQR. It's widely used in clinical settings, in research studies, in public health surveys to assess suicide risk, especially amongst at-risk populations and youth. And this rate of suicidal ideation that we found through our study is actually higher than ones that use the SBQR in their own work for both the ANHPI and the general populations in the literature that's available. And to dig a little deeper on why we're seeing this, we did see that one of the biggest stressors on mental health is pressure. And so both from themselves and from their families, but also racial and ethnic experiences really playing a big role. So especially hearing about API incidents or seeing or hearing negative comments, stereotypes, jokes about race or ethnicity, microaggressions, and that feeling of just that I don't belong because of my race or ethnicity. These were all factors that impact young people's mental health quite adversely. Another startling fact was this is very common amongst young people. 93% of ANHPI young people have experienced some form of race-based discrimination in just the past year. And again, we have more findings in our report, but we're proud to have published these studies in collaboration with our advisory groups. Qin mentioned Dr. Jennifer Lee, the founding director of the Asian American Initiative. She was our chair for the status index last year, and she's been an integral part of our studies over the years. And I'm happy to dive into a little bit more into why we collect this data, what we do with it. But just want to say that we're not also collecting data for the sake of data, but want to be intentional about how it's being used, both to inform our own programming and our work. And so the series of research studies that we are planning on releasing this year are around generating more granular insights as we do more place-based work, understanding key needs of our communities in specific cities. I'll stop there and turn it to Alex.
Thank you, Shruti. And I'm just going to jump in and remind Alex and Chris to keep the comments to maybe 5 or 6 minutes so that we have time for the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Shruti. Appreciate it. I'm going to share my screen right now. Can everyone see it? Great. It's an honor to be here today. Shruti, we look forward for working with you and the TAV team using Amplify API for the next status index. That's going to be great. I've really followed the status index for a while, and it's a great data there. And Qin, thank you for being part of the Amplify API Advisory Council for the past 3 years. We look forward to continued great work with you. So today I'm going to talk about Amplify API. Some of my backstory coming here, I spent 20 plus years doing market research, survey research with Fortune 500 companies. And over that time, there was always that looking at demographics, looking at white and then white and black, and then white and black Hispanic. And I was never able to get the private sector or the companies to get an interest in looking at the ANHPI community. Even today, it still doesn't happen as much as it should be. So I joined NORC at the University of Chicago because I saw that they were starting the first panel for public opinion panel scientifically designed to represent the NHPI community. It was a partnership between NORC, who has a history of building these rigorous panels, and AARP, which is the nation's largest nonprofit, and they have a history of representing and doing great work with underrepresented groups. So Amplify API is the largest, most representative, and only survey panel of ANHPI communities. And what makes it special, it's randomly selected with a known non-zero probability. So what does that mean for those that may not understand probability-based samples? What this means, it's fully randomized sample. You can't fake your way onto this panel. And by panel, I mean it's a standing community of people that can take survey research over time. A lot of times folks use different organizations use non-probability opt-in panels. And what those are is you can join in, you get your professional survey takers, your bots, and there's fraud with them. With using Amplify API, because it is randomly selected, you don't have fraud, and it's truly representative of the ANHPI community. What's really important with this is we conduct surveys in 5 languages, right? How representative of the NHPI community can you be if you're only doing it in English, right? Or only doing it in English and online. So we conduct this in English, Mandarin, Cantonese, Korean, and Vietnamese. And 92% of the total NHPI households that we go to are satisfied with this. We are trying to grow this out, but this is an expensive endeavor. What we're trying to do, see on the next slide, we launched in 2023. Our plan was to have representation to get at least 300 sample size of the 7 largest ethnicities by 2026. Building this type of panel is expensive. It costs nearly to impanel one panel member, and it costs nearly $500 to $1,000 for each one. We have a lot of we get out from private grants. We've been able to grow the panel and excuse me, sorry. And some of the and over time, excuse me. Yeah. So yep. Sorry about that. So like I said before, we're trying to grow this panel to 6,000 to represent the 7 largest ethnicities. Unfortunately, we've lost an NSF grant that was $1 million, which would have helped us reach those not hard to reach populations. So I'm going to share some data from the work we've done with different community organizations. For example, is Community of 100. They recently released the report where they said fewer than 1 in 4 Americans support a ban on Chinese researchers. You can see that on the chart on the left. higher for Republicans versus Democrats. We also do a lot of work with Stop AAPI Hate, and from work that we've done in 2025, asking about uh, uh, their experience with hate and harassment in 2024, you can see over 50% of South Asians, East Asians, and Southeast Asians have reported one type of hate over the past year in 2024. We also do work with AAPA data. That's a chart on the right. And this measures trends over time, the way things are going in the country over time. And what they saw from December 23 to April 2025 to December 25th, the communities compared to 2023, it's much or somewhat worse. It was clear, 6 in 10 said it was much or somewhat worse compared to 2023, where 40% only said things were much or somewhat worse. Heard some of my other panelists here talking about the importance of disaggregated data. So we did work with ARP that took a look at how well they're managing financially over these past few years, sorry. And you can see here that the number that said they were living comfortably was much higher for South Asians and East Asians compared to Southeast Asians and HPI. So this goes to the importance of being able to look at disaggregated data. We also have another slide here that's work we've done with ARP. This was asking about mental health conditions and conditions that they have reported. You see here, when it comes to anxiety and depression, it's much higher for the NHPI community and the Southeast Asian community compared to South Asians and East Asians. Finally, putting this type of panel together, as I mentioned before, it's extremely expensive. So it takes partnerships from so many groups. ARP, we have funders from different foundations or organizations, and also many community partners. Here you can see the QR code. As I mentioned, we've done several surveys over the past 3 years. You can use this QR code to go to our website, and you'll be able to see a lot of different survey data and research that we've run over time. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Alex. Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. And thank you to Qin and to Van and the Asian American Institute for including me in the panel today. I don't have any slides. I'm just going to speak to you about a unique initiative that we have going on in New York City. If I think back to Qin's opening remarks and opening questions, one of the questions was sort of what comes to mind when we think of the term Asian American. And one thing it made me think about was just the tremendous diversity of experience under the umbrella of the term Asian American. And I think that's reflected in a lot of the presentations that we've seen today, both diversity of experience over time, over the long sweep of history, and then also diversity across ethnicity and country of origin. But also there's tremendous diversity of experience, I think, across geography and across local communities. So the experiences of Asian Americans in Los Angeles or Houston or rural counties in rural America versus in the experiences in New York City are tremendous as well. And I'm going to talk to you about one effort that we have going on here in New York City, where we've been trying to look not just at the Asian American community, but at the experience of New Yorkers more broadly, including the Asian American community in New York City. It's an effort that we're calling the Poverty Tracker. It's a partnership with the organization Robin Hood, whose mission is to fight poverty here in the city. And this is a long-standing project at this point that we've been doing for over a decade, since 2012 were the first surveys that we did in the city. And Robin Hood came to us back then, really trying to understand the experience of poverty in the city, frustrated at the time with the lack of information, the lack of data on how New Yorkers were doing and how New Yorkers were coping with poverty and how they were experiencing mobility into and out of poverty over time. So the census data, which Stacie showed in great detail, are these snapshots, and now that there's some improved measures of poverty within that snapshot data that the census heroically provides, but they're still snapshots, and they're still snapshots of the population at one point in time. And Well, that's very useful. There was a lack of data on that followed the same people over time to try to understand people's experiences of mobility and the factors that are associated with people climbing out of poverty. And that's really where the poverty tracker came in. So beginning in 2012, we began surveying here at Columbia a representative sample, a probability sample, like Alex was describing in his nationwide panel, following New Yorkers over time. So we concentrated on adults in the city, anyone who was 18 years or old and above. And we recruited people with a random probability of selection. That so we'd be able to, the sample would stand for and represent the diversity of experiences in New York City. And critically and importantly, we would survey people over time. So the first recruitment that we did was in 2012, and we recruited a panel of about 2,500 people and followed that sample for the next 2 years, surveying people for every 3 months in the city. And then we recruited a new panel in early 2015 and began following them. That was a larger sample, around 4,000 to 5,000 people. And we recruited people via phone. So we worked with a survey firm to recruit people, via random digit dialing, which is a way to, just quickly call through numbers of New York City residents. And then Columbia, our team in-house, would survey people for every follow-up every 3 months. And importantly, we tracked this measure of income poverty called the supplemental poverty measure, which Stacie talked about briefly, but it's a widely thought to be an improved measure of income poverty. And then we tried to move beyond just measures of income poverty to capture a wider array of indicators of people's economic and social well-being. So we capture a lot of data surveying people every 3 months, but our other core measures are looking at people's experiences of what we call material hardship. So that's people's actual difficulties meeting their routine expenses. So difficulties providing housing, affording food, staying up to date with your bills and utilities, seeing doctors or medical providers, or not being able to because of the cost. And then we move beyond economics to look at people's health. So we look at people's health challenges, their experiences of, for example, work-limiting disabilities, also measures of people's psychological distress and mental health and well-being. And critically, we look at these over time. So we've had 6 cohorts now of New Yorkers that we've followed over time. And I think part of the reason I was invited tonight was because, it's a representative series of samples of New York City adults. So we capture people across all 5 boroughs, all walks of life, all ethnicities, genders, ages, etc. But historically, prior to 2020, we only surveyed New Yorkers in English and Spanish. And so that obviously in a city of 8 million people with incredibly linguistic diversity, that limited what we were able to say about all the populations and diverse populations that are encompassed in the city. So starting in 2020, with support from Robinhood, we were actually able to try to take steps to begin to solve this problem so that we could speak more confidently about Asian American New Yorkers. Because one of the real chief limitations in only surveying in English and Spanish is that there's large segments of the New York City population that are speaking other languages besides English and can't take our surveys in English or Spanish. So we added a Mandarin as our third language that we do our surveys in every 3 to 4 months, as well as simplified Chinese for people taking the surveys online and over the internet. And we know that's only the tip of the iceberg, right? There's lots of other linguistic diversity in the city. We would love to be able to, over time, increase that even further to, languages like Vietnamese and Korean and Tagalog, and make sure that we're capturing all the rich diversity that's going on in New York City. But that allows us to speak since 2020 for the first time about the experiences of New Yorkers of Chinese origin, and allows us to begin to more confidently speak to the experiences of Asian American New Yorkers in the city. And what we found, at least for poverty, I'll talk a little bit more in the rest of the panel if we have time about other findings, is that the poverty rates for Asian New Yorkers in the city are really distressingly high. For Asian American New Yorkers in New York City, roughly 24%, according to our most recent data, of adults of Asian ethnicity were experiencing FBM poverty. And those are very close rates to the experiences of Black and Latino New Yorkers. The poverty rates for white New Yorkers, white non-Hispanic New Yorkers in the city was only about 13% in the same year. whereas the rates for Latino and Black New Yorkers were in the neighborhood of the Asian results that I just around 26% for Latino New Yorkers, and I think it was 23% in the same year for Black non-Latino New Yorkers. So really an experience of poverty that's much more analogous to groups that have been subject to structural discrimination and structural racism for decades and generations. So I'll stop there. Since we did this in 2020, we've had a couple more panels that we recruited in 2022, 2024. We're about to go into the field with a seventh panel that we'll start recruiting in about a month. And that'll really open up the possibilities as we begin to look, across the years and across these groups. We'll be able to sort of pool this data and try to understand not just the poverty rate, but the overall diversity of experiences, across time and across groups in the city, which we're excited about getting into. I'll pass back to Ben.
All right, thank you, Chris. That was a terrific set of presentations. And let me start with the first question on data, because that's really the big topic that all of you spoke about. And I want to pose a question for C, Stacie, and Chris, which is, when you look at TAF and Amplify API, it's so exciting. We get new data, new resources. But from the perspective of academia, where we are coming from, what new data do we need, and what challenges do you think are preventing us from getting the data we need to answer the questions that we are interested in?
I'm happy to, well, I'm happy to jump in.
Go ahead, Chris.
Well, we're doing this in New York, and I think Alex touched on this too in his remarks. Just it is intensive. There's a tremendous amount of diversity, and linguistic diversity, I think, is one of the main challenges, right? And if everyone were in the same neighborhood, then you could go, survey people in a single neighborhood and get a large enough sample to be able to speak to the experiences of a group. But when you have that tremendous amount of diversity, that's not just linguistic diversity, but geographic diversity, it becomes very expensive, especially in a world where you're trying to get these random samples and probabilistic samples to try to be able to survey at the sample sizes that you need to be able to speak confidently about groups. So we encountered that. We're a longitudinal study, like I said, so we're we pay people for their time for taking a survey with us. And so in order to do that, and even just to conduct the surveys, we need to have enough staff on board in order to speak the languages. It's not just about the 15 minutes you're on the phone with someone collecting a survey. It's also about, oh, they didn't get their check, or someone didn't get, or they need a call back at 6:30. You need to have someone who can call them back at 6:30. And so I think that's the reason for some of the expense that Alex talks about. So it is a challenge, and I think but there are lots of efforts, including Alex's and others, that are trying to do this efficiently and do it routinely.
C?
Yes, I will just mention the data I'm using, which is called the administrative big data. So the US government has collected many data related to, for example, tax records, our health insurance claims, our census records, and our firm registrations, and all other different type of administrative data. And now all this can be linked using a unique identification number, which is similar to Social Security number that we can use to uniquely identify a person. And the data can be accessed at the Federal Statistics Research Data Center. And there is one located Baruch College in New York City. So I think this really opens up a lot of research opportunities for scholars who are interested in Asian Americans, which has been historically a very small population and often not captured in nationally representative surveys because of their small size, or they often have been pooled with, other racial ethnic groups. Only we see, for example, are Black, white, Asian, and others. So this administrative data now allow us to examine in detail, for example, heterogeneity among different Asian ethnic groups, which has been part of the agenda, I know, of Van's research. But I think there are also some limitations. For example, some of this data only include waged workers, for example, from the W-2, the tax records. But we all know that our self-employment has been traditionally higher among Asian Americans than among other racial ethnic groups. And many workers, they don't really file a W-2 form. So this subpopulation would be omitted from some of this administrative data. And also some of this data collected by, for example, American Community Survey, it's not longitudinal in nature. So we really cannot follow a person over time as we would observe them in some of the well-known nationally representative surveys, for example, the panel study of income dynamics. So those will be the data challenges, but still, I think they can be addressed with more data collection efforts.
Thank you. Stacie?
Yeah, thank you. I would agree with both what Chris and she said, specifically about the diversity of languages offered. And that just makes me think about how there is this need for more community partnerships, right? Like community partnerships, not only in being able to do outreach with communities to complete surveys, but to also just maintain that trust, right, for folks to return and conduct these longitudinal surveys. Something else I've noticed in terms of data limitation is the biracial and those who are multiple Asian ethnic groups, right? Like even though the Census Bureau does have some indicators that show this biracial and different ethnic groups, it's not granular enough to the level where we can look at all the combinations. So that's another area that is limited at the moment.
Thank you. My next question goes to Alex and Shruti, and it really has to do with the data collection from the perspective of where you sit. What has been the reception to the research that you do, and what's the funding situation like to launch the type of work that you're launching?
Yeah, Shruti, I can go with it. Like I said before, it's an expensive endeavor. You can picture like $500 to $1,000 for one panelist, right? So it takes a lot of effort from different foundations. If I wasn't clear before, it was, with the current administration, we lost our NSF grant, and that was $1 million, which would have gone to help us recruit the hard to reach populations. We noticed in our panel, right? As we were growing this, we were getting too many Chinese, too many highly educated NHPIs, right? So our goal with the recruits, the future one that we lost also was to get at the harder to reach population so we can be as representative as possible. So that's been a large challenge for us. But as the other panelists mentioned, like working with the other community organizations, the foundation to figure out ways how to work together to make sure this panel that it's one of its kind is able to sustain, right? And part of that sustain, and this is one of the challenges, to quote the Field of Dreams, like we thought, if you build it, the clients will come. We're still trying to get more people to use the panel. Our panelists, because they know the NHPI panels, they know their voices have not been heard before. They are extremely engaged compared to the Gen Pop 18 plus, where their response rate is maybe like 16% for a survey. Our panelists are close to 32%. So think that's significant, right? Because they know their voice matters. And so we want to be able to keep them engaged through more clients coming in, more community organizations doing work. But it's expensive. It's expensive for the community organizations to do this type of work because they're under a crunch as well. So I think it's all those things. Those are the biggest kind of challenges we're having. And it is truly working together across. And the data that we have that's out there are community organizations do want to share it. They want to amplify that. So that's part of the goal of Amplify API is not only a survey provider, right, this panel, but also to convene these different organizations who might be there in their own silos, but be able to share the data across all NHPI groups.
Yeah, agree with everything Alex said. I think there is, when we've presented our data either on status or the youth mental health work, or our city-specific work, we've always seen that there's a lot of hunger, there's appetite for having this kind of data. At TAF, we tend to work with different stakeholders, including media and nonprofits, but also funding agencies and corporates, as well as policymakers. And we're really seeing that there's desire to have this kind of granularity, so that they're able to use the evidence to advocate for different causes. And then I think, speaking to the funding situation, agreed, it's really expensive to do this work and to do it in a way that is thoughtful, that's ethical and rigorous. And so I think, just thinking about ways that we can, again, collaborate, or we can work with each other, learn from each other. And I think if there are things, for instance, that Chris and his team are asking in the poverty tracker, that, what are other ways like we can work with each other so we can feed in some of the questions that probably didn't make it into a different, work that we're doing. So would love to think about ways to collaborate so that we have scarce resources. So how can we make the best use of that?
I have one more question for the entire panel, and then I'm opening up for Q&A. And it's really about, thinking about the narratives about Asian Americans. The question is, what actions can we take to advance policy research and debate on Asian Americans? How do we change the narratives? Anyone could start.
I guess I'll go real quick. I know we're running, but this
And
is
you each have 60 seconds.
all right. So then this is part of the title, but part of the organization we work with, AAPI Data, they created DNA, right? So what does DNA mean? It means data, narrative, action, right? Make sure you have quality data, right? Make sure it's storytelling, right? Because there's a lot of numbers. Are we able to get that data out there and tell it in the proper way where you're going to persuade policy making, right? And the most important thing, action, not just taking action to make sure that the data doesn't sit on your desk, but action are you providing briefings on Capitol Hill like we do at Stop ABA and ABI Data, partnerships with grassroots organizations like C100, API Vote, National Council of Asian Pacific Americans. Are you getting into journalists so they can contextualize the stories? I think it's important the most important part is that action, getting that data out there to make sure it's changing and implementing policies.
I can go next. I think in the spheres of influence that we have in our networks, trying to push for disaggregated data to the extent possible. And also, a lot of times APIs are missing from the room, they're missing from the decision-making table. So how can we sort of push for having more API representation? Asking the questions like, okay, are you thinking about this specific issue, but also in the light of the unique challenges that the API community might be facing? And so trying to be that voice and doing that in our networks.
You see?
I think traditionally Asian Americans are highly segregated from the mainstream society. They have their own ethnic enclaves, they have their ethnic economy. I think to increase just the exposure between different racial ethnic groups can make Asian Americans more visible, but also to encourage more understanding or appreciation of diverse cultures, our languages, heritages. All this can help Asians to tap into traditionally white-dominated occupations or labor market segments, but also to increase their impact in public policy.
Yeah.
I would sort of echo what people are saying in terms of the need for investment in data, whether it be survey data and also, I think, you're talking about administrative data and other data sources that we need to tap, not just survey data, but the wide array. But the need for disaggregation, as Sruthi was talking about, is really key here. So in the poverty tracker, we made this investment to try to do our surveys in Mandarin and simplified Chinese, which again begs, poses the need to be doing that in other languages and following people over time in other groups as well. But even among the Chinese New Yorker population, the New Yorkers of Chinese origin, there's tremendous diversity of experience as well, right? So I talked about the overall poverty rate for Asian New Yorkers or adults in the city, but that masks a tremendous amount of diversity just in and of itself, right? So groups in New York City, I just noted down a few, but like Asian New Yorkers who are foreign born had 3 times the poverty rate as Asian New Yorkers who were born in the US, 27% versus 9%. Asian New Yorkers who have more limited English proficiency, the poverty rates were 40%, so 4 in 10, as opposed to about 15% for people whose primary language was English. Seniors is another group in New York City where seniors from Asian American seniors had about a third of those New Yorkers were experiencing poverty. And that's just poverty. That's just income poverty. When we're talking, in the poverty tracker, we're looking at material hardship and health challenges as well. That the Asian American New Yorkers in our sample tended to be healthier, which is a silver lining and good news from that perspective. And they also had lower hardship rates. Material hardship rates were closer to the rates for white non-Hispanic groups as opposed to the poverty rates, which were elevated. And so you need that kind of sample size and be able to disaggregate and to be able to start to begin to understand that diversity of experience and the role that policy can play in hopefully ameliorating it.
Stacie.
This is a great question. What a big question. I think my response to that is when I think about how we measure things, right? And particularly when we study things that are quite sensitive, like poverty, mental health issues, discrimination. I find that the way we measure it and the way we name it can, in and of itself, be a challenge when we survey with these communities. I was speaking recently to someone who does community organizing for Asian Americans in Philadelphia, as well as some of the rural areas in Pennsylvania. And they shared that they've noticed, especially those who are more recent immigrants, they want to be associated with this American dream narrative, right? And so they want to distance themselves from these indicators that are perhaps indicative of hardship, right? Or scarcity. So even just naming things like healthcare underutilization or a mental health crisis are, I think, terms and measures that can deter some of the community members. So that would be my answer, is to perhaps figure out a way to have more inclusive measures that can reach folks in a better and more holistic way.
Shruti, you want to have a final word on this question on actions?
Nothing more to add. I think mainly about disaggregated data and being a voice.
So there's a question in the chat. And again, if you are in the audience, please type any questions you have for us, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. There's a question about political participation among Asian Americans and how can we collect better data to understand that aspect of their life. And here I'm just going to add another question to it, which is, when you think about Asian Americans, what misperceptions people have about our communities that you wanted to bring data to light to push back on in your own work?
I can say a little bit. We haven't done a lot of work around political participation or voter behavior, but Van, I'm responding to your question around other kinds of misperceptions that exist. We had a question in our status index, which was around leadership styles, and we did see that a lot of Americans tend to not see Asian Americans as people who can lead, have stereotypical authoritative kinds of leadership styles, and also just being labeled. Some of the descriptors that came up when we asked about Asian Americans was exotic or foreigner. So, those kinds of stereotypes continue to exist. I talked about the model minority myth. So we are seeing that people tend to think we are, good at math, we're successful, but we're also the kinds of people who might sort of keep our heads down, work, but not be in that, hit that bamboo ceiling of not being in leadership roles. I think others are, disease carriers, being seen as a threat, being seen as, as part of that, like yellow peril, those kinds of perceptions continue to exist.
Let me just add that AAPI data has collected a lot of surveys on voting. So I would also direct you there, Cheryl Zhang, in case you're interested. But there's a perception that Asian Americans are basically a silent minority, that we're not very politically engaged and active. And that's obviously wrong, because a lot of our Asian American fellows have basically been elected to high offices, as you have pointed out. I want to come to the next question, which is about Central Asians and West Asians. Are they Asians or are they not? And to what extent our data is capturing this particular population? And OC, you responded and said that the census does have these groups. And of course, they are part of our broader counting. But what about the rest of you who work on the population? Where do Central Asians fit in, or West Asians for that matter, who are basically on the border of Russia and Turkey, to our understanding or collective mapping of Asian Americans? Alex, since you are the person who champions the API data.
I was actually wanted to answer your other question about voter, because our clients are AAPI data. As I mentioned before, we release a monthly survey that they do, and again, that's accessible. Just go to AAPI data, and and the importance of that is they do comparisons. They talk about the most important issues, but a number of different issues over the course of the year, and they compare it to Black, white, and Hispanic. So you can see the differences there, right? So when it comes to voters, for an issue that we have been trying to deal with the AAP data team, is the understanding of the Vietnamese community. It was shown that a lot of the Vietnamese community are more Republican, but from our data that we're doing, a part of our sample comes from California. As you can imagine, half of our panel, because there's so many HPIs in California, is from that area. So we found that the Vietnamese we did have from California, where they were leaning more towards Democratic versus Republican. So we're part of the ongoing recruits that we're trying to do is trying to get more Vietnamese from, let's say, the Houston area, right? Because they might lean more towards being Republican. So those are the issues and the voter problems that we're trying to figure out, like what are we hearing on the street, and how do we properly represent that? But again, it costs money to be able to go to different cities in the way we recruit, because it has to be fully randomized. Yeah.
If I could come to another question from Anne Chang. Actually, no, not Anne Chang. Yes, Alex, you mentioned that in 2024, over 54% of Asians experienced some type of hate. What type of hate is that? Verbal, physical, and what does it look like? And why are we still having these incidents in 2025?
Yeah, I recommend you go to the Stop AAPI Hate website. They do a number of reporting full-time, real-time data, especially in New York City. But that question was asked, what hate have they experienced? And it could be, there were a number of forms. Was verbal abuse, bullying. So it wasn't just one type of it, but we listed 7 or 8 types of abuse, and that was a number that led to over 50. I think it was like 50 to 54%, depending on the region, for East Asian, Southeast Asian, all the way down to also the NHPI communities.
Before I go to the next question, I just want to take a moment to see if any one of you had more to say about the previous topics we just covered. I don't want to jump ahead without pausing. See, Stacie, Chris.
Well, I know Qin's done some research on this actually too in the poverty tracker. She's one of the investigators on the poverty tracker, but we've fielded similar questions. They're probably not identical to the ones Alex is talking about, but the experiences of everyday discrimination. And yeah, that hasn't been a thing that's come down a lot. And if anything, it's kind of gone up since the end of the Trump administration and since COVID. So in our data, we saw think it was around 70%, a little bit over 70% of both New Yorkers of Chinese origin and also the Asian American sample more broadly. And I think it was 2022-ish, reporting at least one of these experiences. And that was way up from the first time we fielded those questions in 2020, which was around still high, 40%, 43%. At that time, including very severe things like in 2022 is over 40% experienced like direct threats or harassment. And that too was up from around 20% in just 2 years earlier. But Qin, you came on camera.
I also want to just mention briefly about the previous question about Russian and other Central Asian groups. Remember that the race question is self-identified. So it's not really the researchers who designed the questionnaire to classify a person into these different racial or ethnic groups, but it's really the identity of the respondents, who choose to be either classified as whites or Asians. So this raises another question that sociologists often talk about, particularly from Roger Brubaker's theory about groupism. Whether we should group these different racial ethnic groups into broader categories, which may exaggerate differences between groups while overlooking differences within groups. Or shall we just work with the most disaggregated ethnic group? These are still hotly debated questions in academic work, but also in policy. But I think so far we only have partial answers, and we need to have more work for us to better understand whether there is a real, pan-Asian ethnicity identity, and whether we should create these aggregated categories for academic work or for policy designs.
I just want to add a footnote to that, which is that there has been a real movement toward data disaggregation for Asian Americans. And the thinking behind that is if you have disaggregated data, you could always aggregate up if you need to the bigger categories that Steve was talking about. But if you don't collect them at all, which is the case for centuries or decades, we can't even begin thinking about intra-Asian differences the way that Stacie has presented today. I just wanted to also go to a new question, which is, I was wondering, this is from Gina Liu, whether there have been any research looking into the connection of poverty and mental health, specifically among Asian Americans. Stacie and Sruthi, you have any thoughts on this? Poverty and mental health and that connection, but especially among Asian American respondents with regards to adverse childhood experiences. What do we know, if anything?
If anything, yes. I saw that question and I was trying to find a paper I read recently, so I'm still looking, but I'll link it when I find it.
I can add a little to that.
Okay.
Because we do so many surveys with different organizations, and there is a linkage, right? So we're doing work with Community of 100, right? And they're doing survey questions on the perpetual foreigner or minority myth, and also the rhetoric. Yeah, and this goes to your other question on why is this still continuing, the discrimination, right? So 54% of Americans, this is just Americans overall, but even higher for ANHPI, said Trump's China rhetoric hurts people of Chinese descent. So you take that, and that's why that number is still 50% and continuing. Also, we saw that rhetoric, so that also leads to mental health and anxiety issues. So you can only imagine that poverty also would lead to mental health, and it's an easy connection when you're going through these many things. And again, the work we're doing with Stop AAPI Hate, they've done a number of research questions on the impact of hate on mental health, and it's a very strong correlation. I don't have the exact numbers right now, but as I mentioned, if you just go to their website, there's a high correlation between discrimination and mental health in all the ANHPI communities, especially with the NHPI community.
I just want to underscore what Alex and also Chris just shared, which is that the rate of Asians who reported experiences of discrimination are still quite high. And yet in the public perception, the anti-Asian spike in violence is past. So that's one of the misperceptions that the public has about the experiences of the average Asian Americans even today that we see. I want to come to, maybe this is the final question. I'll pose it to all of you. This is from an anonymous attendee who wrote, "Thank you for your time. I was interested in what specific recent policy changes there might have been in response to greater representations and findings in your recent data." Let me sort of rephrase this slightly just to add to, which is, now that we have a lot of new data, has this new data brought about new changes in policy that would improve the lives of Asian Americans in your work?
I'll let others take that. I'll just say a couple things. I direct a center on poverty and social policy, and obviously I've been talking about the poverty tracker. So we're very focused on policies that affect people experiencing low income and material hardship. So I tend to focus more on safety net policy, tax policy, income support policies, et cetera. And there, what we've seen, is major changes in 2025 that are both restricting access and increasing exclusion from participation in these programs, and then just more generally making the policies harder to access, which is going to increase hardship over time. So in the reconciliation bill in 2025, we saw dramatic changes to the food stamp program, to the tax system, to the Medicaid program, all in the direction of restricting future access. And that included things like making eligibility tighter for things like tax credits, which do a lot of anti-poverty work in this country, in terms of things like having to have a social security number both for the children and the parents, in order to be able to have that, even if someone's a taxpayer and paying into the system. So unfortunately, there's some discouraging policy developments in that front.
Any other thoughts? It has to be 30 seconds.
I could say that.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
Alan.
Sruthi.
I was going to say that not specifically a policy change, but because of some of our work in Seattle looking at safety challenges and work that the mayor's office has also conducted, we were able to use that data to bring different stakeholders, including corporate partners and foundations, and the mayor's office, and work with policymakers to pilot an ambassador initiative that is has people, trained ambassadors patrolling the Seattle Chinatown area to help improve safety overall. Alex?
Yeah, these are challenging times, but the work that we are doing is impacting policy. For example, I'll just bring up the Stop API hate work again. That briefing was given, this was before the election, but it was in the hands of almost every congressional member, right? And as well as the cabinet at that time. So it's getting to the highest level. And it did help secure language access policies for Stop API hate, obviously benefiting this community. And it informed, federal actions on community safety. So that was, very inspiring, and they continue to do good work on that end.
Well, I wish we have all the time in the world, but we do not. And I am going to just say thank you to the panelists and turn it back to my wonderful colleague, Qin Gao, who's going to have the final word.
Thank you, Ben, Stacie, Sruthi, Chris, Alex, and Xi. What a wonderful discussion. I learned a lot, and hopefully this inspires our audience members to go onto your websites, read your research, and maybe take action. This is fantastic. I also invite all of you to join our next event, which will be in the evening of March 5th. It's a Thursday. We are collaborating with the Columbia School of Arts to have a film screening of Rosemead, focusing very much on mental health, family relations, and how we are part of the American society. So I invite you to join us. Thank you all so much. Thank you for being with us.